The Texas sun dipped below the horizon of the ranch porch at sunset, painting the sky in bruised purples and deep oranges, while an empty rocking chair moved slightly in the wind, waiting for a master who was miles away fighting a battle no one saw coming. The silence in the dressing room deep within the bowels of the NRG Stadium in Houston was not peaceful. It was heavy. It was a suffocating blanket that settled over the room the moment the last assistant closed the heavy steel door, leaving the king of country alone. Just minutes ago, 50,000 souls had been screaming his name, singing along to every word about Amarillo and oceanfront property, their voices blending into a roar that shook the concrete foundations of the arena. Now the only sound was the rhythmic hum of the central air conditioning unit and the shallow, steady breathing of a man who had given everything he had to the stage. George Strait sat before the vanity mirror, staring at a reflection that the world knew better than he knew himself sometimes. The bright bulbs bordering the glass illuminated the deep lines etched around his eyes lines, carved by decades of squinting into stage lights and looking out over endless highways. He reached for a white towel, wiping the sweat from his forehead with a slow, deliberate motion. His hand trembled slightly, not from age, but from the adrenaline crash that always followed the final bow. He was 69 years old, and while the spirit was willing, the body demanded its tithe. He unbuttoned the top button of his starch-stiffened shirt, letting out a long, weary sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the entire tour. All he wanted was the silence of the ranch. He wanted to hear the crickets instead of the feedback loops. He wanted to see the silhouette of the oak trees instead of the blinding flash of cameras. Most of all, he wanted to hear Norma's voice. His phone sat on the marble countertop, vibrating against the hard surface with a harsh buzzing sound that cut through the quiet. It was not a ringtone. It was a single long vibration, indicating a message. George frowned. His personal number was a guarded secret, known only to family, his manager, and a handful of friends who had survived the decades alongside him. He reached out his large, weathered hand, hovering over the device. The screen lit up with a cold blue light illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. There was no name, no number he recognized, just a string of digits and a single shortened hyperlink. A younger man might have ignored it, a more cautious man might have deleted it. But George came from a time when a message meant something when you didn't hide behind screens. A strange coldness pricked at the base of his neck, a primal instinct that he had learned to trust over years of navigating the treacherous waters of fame. He tapped the link. The screen flickered black for a second, before resolving into a grainy but unmistakable live video feed. The breath left George's lungs, as if he had been kicked in the chest by a spooked horse. The image was shaky at first, as if the camera was being positioned on a shelf or a table, but then it stabilized and the horror of the reality set in. It was Norma. His Norma. The woman who had been his compass, his anchor, and his heart since high school. She was sitting in a high-backed velvet chair, her posture rigid, her hands gripping the armrests so tightly that her knuckles were white even through the pixelated transmission. She was not at the ranch. She was not safe at home. She was in a room with sleek glass walls and modern art, a sterile corporate environment that smelled of money and lack of soul even through the phone screen. George recognized the setting immediately. It was the VIP private suite at the charity gala downtown, the event she had attended on their behalf, while he performed the show. But she was not smiling. She was terrified. Shadows moved at the edge of the frame. Men in expensive suits, vultures in Italian silk. Then a voice cut through the tinny speaker of the smartphone, a voice that George had hoped never to hear again. It was smooth-cultured and dripping with a venomous arrogance that made George's hand clench into a fist. Julian Thorne, the real estate developer who had been circling the Strait family lands like a coyote waiting for a calf to stray. Thorne walked into the frame, his back to the camera, standing over Norma, with a predatory loom. He placed a document on the low table in front of her. "Mrs. Strait," the voice said, oozing with false polite concern. "We really don't want to make this difficult. Your husband is currently finishing his encore. The crowd loves him. He is busy entertaining the masses. We simply need your signature to release the deed. It is a donation after all, a tax write-off. Why bother him with the details?" Norma looked up, and for a split second she looked directly into the camera lens, as if she knew George was watching, as if she could feel his eyes on her from miles away. Her voice was shaking, but her chin was high. "I told you, Julian. We do not sell the South Pasture. It has been in the family for 3 generations, and we certainly do not sign contracts under duress in a backroom while my husband is on stage." Thorne laughed, a dry sound devoid of humor. "Duress is such an ugly word, Norma. Let's call it aggressive negotiation. You see, the project is already approved. The bulldozers are scheduled. If you don't sign this as a donation, we will release the files, the fabricated environmental reports, the lawsuits against the foundation. We will bury your husband's legacy in so much legal paper that he won't be able to sing a note without a lawyer present." George watched the screen, his blood turning to ice and then instantly to boiling lava. This was not a business deal. This was an ambush. Thorne had waited for the perfect moment when George was physically isolated, trapped in the belly of the stadium, surrounded by 50,000 people yet completely alone. He was using Norma as leverage, a pawn in a game of greed. The audacity of it was breathtaking. They thought the cowboy was just a singer. They thought the hat was a costume. They had forgotten that before the records and the fame, George was a man who worked the land, a man who protected what was his. He stood up so abruptly that the chair flew backward and crashed against the wall. He didn't bother with his jacket. He didn't check his hair in the mirror. He grabbed the phone, his eyes never leaving the small screen where his wife was being tormented. He stormed out of the dressing room, the heavy door slamming behind him with a thunderous boom that echoed down the concrete corridor. His security detail, a team of large men who were used to managing crazed fans, looked up in surprise from their positions in the hallway. "Boss?" one of them asked, stepping forward, his hand raising instinctively. "We have the meet and greet in 20 minutes. The donors are waiting." George didn't even slow down. He walked past them with a stride that ate up the ground, his boots striking the floor with a rhythmic, deadly cadence. Cancel it. Cancel it? The head of security, a man named Miller, jogged to keep up. "George, you can't just leave. The traffic is gridlocked, the protocols. We need to get the SUVs ready." George stopped and turned. The look in his eyes stopped Miller dead in his tracks. It was a look of cold fury, a look that stripped away the celebrity and left only the protector. "I am taking my truck. You stay here. You keep the press away. If anyone asks, I am indisposed. Do not follow me, Miller. This is not for you." He pushed through the loading dock doors and into the humid Houston night. The air was thick and heavy, promising a storm. His personal truck, a black, heavy-duty pickup that he kept for the rare moments he could escape unnoticed, was parked in the restricted bay. He climbed in, tossing the phone onto the dashboard mount so the video remained visible. The engine roared to life, a guttural growl that matched the rage in his chest. He peeled out of the stadium lot, ignoring the shocked waves of the parking attendants, the tires screeching against the asphalt as he merged onto the chaotic city streets. On the screen, the situation was deteriorating. Thorne was leaning closer to Norma, invading her personal space. The psychological pressure was ramping up. "You think he's coming?" Thorne sneered on the video, his face distorted by the angle. "He's a brand, Norma. He's a corporation. He's not going to risk a scandal for a patch of dirt. He's probably signing autographs right now, smiling that $1,000,000 smile while you sit here. Sign the paper." George gripped the steering wheel so hard the leather creaked. He wove through the traffic, forcing his way into lanes with the sheer size of the truck. The rain began to fall, fat, heavy drops that smeared the city lights into streaks of neon and gold. He was 30 minutes away. 30 minutes was an eternity. In 30 minutes, a spirit could be broken. In 30 minutes, a legacy could be stolen. He needed to be faster. He ran a red light, checking the intersection with the reflexes of a man who had spent his life dodging bulls and bad roads. Horns blared around him, angry and indignant, but he heard nothing but the voice of Julian Thorne and the silence of his wife. Norma spoke again, her voice trembling, but gaining a steel edge that George recognized with a surge of pride. "You don't know him," she said quietly. "You look at the charts and the sales. You don't know the man. He doesn't care about the scandal, Julian. He cares about the truth. And if you think he isn't coming, you are the biggest fool in Texas." Thorne slammed his hand on the table, making the camera jump. "Enough. Sign it or I call the press right now. I have a reporter from the Chronicle on speed dial. I'll tell them the Straits are laundering money through their charity. It doesn't have to be true, Norma. It just has to be printed. Once it's out there, the doubt will never leave. George's heart hammered against his ribs. This was the modern weapon. Not a gun, not a knife, but a lie spread at the speed of light. Thorne was a coward, hiding behind technology, using the digital world to inflict pain that physical wounds couldn't match. George felt a wave of nausea. He was the king of country, a symbol of integrity, and here was a man using that very reputation as a weapon against his wife. The feeling of helplessness was choking him. He was powerful, he was wealthy, he was beloved, but stuck in traffic on I-610. He was just a man in a metal box watching his world under siege. He looked at the screen again. He needed to do something. He couldn't just drive. He needed to let them know the storm was coming. He reached for the phone, keeping one eye on the slick road. He couldn't call Norma. Thorne had likely taken her phone or silenced it. He saw a landline phone on the desk in the video behind Thorne. It was blinking red. Off the hook. Thorne had isolated her completely. Then George saw it. A reflection in the glass window behind Norma. It was faint, obscured by the rain outside the building, but distinct enough. The neon sign of the hotel across the street. The Marquis. He knew the venue. The gala was at the grand ballroom of the hotel adjacent to the Marquis. He knew the layout. He knew the staff. Specifically, he knew the head of security for the venue, a man named Big Ed, who had worked security for George's tours back in the 90s before retiring to a steady job. George hit the voice command on his truck's console. Call Big Ed. The phone rang through the truck's speakers. Once, twice. On the screen, Thorne was pacing, circling Norma like a shark. He was holding a pen out to her, forcing it into her hand. Pick up, Ed. Pick up, damn it, George growled. Yeah? The voice was gruff, confused. It was late. Who is this? Ed, it's George. George Strait. There was a pause. The kind of pause that happens when a legend calls you out of the blue on a Tuesday night. George? Well, I'll be damned. I thought you were playing the stadium tonight. I am done. Listen to me, Ed. This is an emergency. I need you to listen, and I need you to move fast. The tone of George's voice cut through the pleasantries. Big Ed snapped to attention. I'm listening. My wife, Norma. She's in the VIP suite on the top floor. The executive room. Do you have eyes on it? No, that floor is rented out privately tonight. Some developer, Julian Thorne. His guys are working the door. They waved off my team, said it was a private meeting. It's not a meeting, Ed, it's a hostage situation. George's voice was low, deadly calm. He is holding her there. He is coercing her to sign documents. I am watching it on a live feed right now. I'm on my way, Ed said instantly, the sound of a chair scraping and keys jingling audible in the background. I'll get the boys. We'll kick the door in. No, George shouted. No, Ed. If you go in with security, Thorne will panic. He'll claim assault. He'll spin this before I can get there. He has lawyers in that room, Ed. He has cameras. We have to do this my way. What do you need? I need you to clear the path. I am 10 minutes out. I am coming in hot. I don't want to see a valet. I don't want to see a concierge. And I sure as hell don't want to see any of Thorne's goons in the lobby. You neutralize his security downstairs. Quietly. Leave the room to me. I got it. I'll shut down the elevators to the penthouse except for one. I'll be waiting at the service entrance. George. Are you sure about this? George looked at the screen. Norma had pushed the pen away. Thorne had grabbed her wrist. A flash of pure, unadulterated rage blinded George for a second before he pushed it down into the cold, hard pit of his stomach. I have never been more sure of anything in my life, Ed. Clear the way. The line went dead. George pressed the accelerator. The truck surged forward, the engine whining in protest. He was breaking every speed limit in the city. The rain was coming down harder now, a torrential sheet of water that tried to wash the city clean, but some stains were too deep for rain. Some stains needed a different kind of cleansing. On the screen, Thorne released Norma's wrist, but he leaned down, whispering something in her ear. Norma flinched. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She was a Strait. She would not give him the satisfaction. George spoke to the empty truck, his voice rough with emotion. Hold on, Norma, just hold on, darling, I'm coming. The narrative paused in the suspended reality of the drive. It was a moment that transcended the celebrity. It wasn't about the music anymore. It was about the sacred vow made before God decades ago. for better or for worse. This was the worse, and George was bringing the better with him, wrapped in the fury of a husband who had been pushed too far. The digital age thought it could bully the analog man. It thought that because he was old, because he was polite, because he smiled for the cameras, that he was soft. Thorne was making the mistake that many had made before him. He mistook kindness for weakness. He mistook silence for submission. The lights of the city blurred past. The GPS counted down the minutes. 9:87. Thorne turned to the camera on the screen. He picked up the device, holding it close to his face. His eyes were manic. "I know you clicked the link, George. I can see the view count. 1 viewer. That's you. Are you enjoying the show? You have 5 minutes. If I don't have a signature in 5 minutes, I upload the files. Your charity will be under investigation by morning. Your wife will be humiliated. Be smart, George. Stay away. Let her sign. It's just land. Just land." George laughed, a short, bitter bark. Just land. It was the soil his father walked on. It was the dirt where he taught his son to ride. It was the place where he and Norma sat on the porch and watched the sunset like the one he missed today. It wasn't land. It was blood. It was memory. And no man in a suit was going to take it with a PDF file and a threat. The hotel loomed ahead, a tower of glass and light, rising into the stormy sky. George didn't head for the main entrance with its red carpet and flashing cameras. He swung the truck around the back towards the service bay where the garbage trucks and delivery vans docked. He saw a figure standing in the rain, a large man in a security uniform holding a radio. Big Ed. George slammed the brakes, the truck skidding on the wet concrete, coming to a halt inches from the loading dock. He killed the engine. The silence returned instantly, replaced by the drumming of rain. He grabbed the phone from the dashboard. He grabbed his black cowboy hat from the seat beside him, putting it on and pulling the brim low. He opened the door and stepped out into the storm. The rain soaked his shirt, instantly plastering it to his skin, but he didn't feel it. He walked toward Big Ed, who nodded grimly. "Elevator 3 is holding for you," Ed said, his voice tight. "I took care of the 2 guys Thorne had in the lobby. They are taking a nap in the break room, but he has 3 more upstairs inside the suite." George nodded. He didn't stop walking. He clapped a hand on Ed's shoulder as he passed a silent thank you that carried more weight than 1,000 checks. "I'll handle the ones upstairs," George said. He walked into the service elevator. The doors closed, shutting out the noise of the city, shutting out the rain. He was ascending. The numbers on the display climbed higher. 10, 20, 30. Penthouse. He looked at the phone one last time. Thorne was screaming now, losing his composure. Norma was crying silently. George put the phone in his pocket. He didn't need to watch anymore. He was here. He adjusted his cuffs. He straightened his hat. He took a deep breath, inhaling the stale air of the elevator, preparing himself. When the doors opened, he wouldn't be the singer. He wouldn't be the legend. He would be the husband. And God help anyone standing between him and his wife. The elevator chimed. A cheerful, innocent sound that heralded the arrival of judgment. The elevator doors slid open with a soft pneumatic hiss, revealing a corridor that stretched out like the barrel of a gun. The hallway of the executive floor was a world away from the chaotic, rain-slicked loading dock below. Here the air was still and smelled of lavender and floor wax. The carpet was thick enough to swallow the sound of footsteps, a deep burgundy that looked too much like dried blood under the recessed amber lighting. George Strait stepped out of the metal box, a dark silhouette against the polished cream walls. He was dripping wet. Rainwater ran off the brim of his black felt hat, tracking down the lines of his face and soaking into the collar of his shirt. He didn't look like a music icon worth millions. He looked like a storm that had somehow found its way indoors. He paused for a heartbeat, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt, a reflex born of habit, but his hands were curled into loose, dangerous fists. Down the hall, standing guard outside the double mahogany doors of the suite, was a solitary figure, a man in a black suit wearing an earpiece, arms crossed over a chest that was clearly built in a gym rather than on a farm. This was the last line of defense Julian Thorne had set up, confident that his private security could handle any intrusion. George began to walk. His boots, usually rhythmic and musical on a stage, made a heavy, deliberate thud on the floor beneath the carpet. Thud, thud, thud. The sound of a reckoning approaching, of a The guard looked up, his eyes narrowing. He saw a man in a cowboy hat and assumed it was a lost guest or a drunk patron from the gala downstairs. "Sir," the guard said, stepping into the center of the hallway, holding up a hand, "this floor is restricted. Private event. You need to turn around and use the main elevators." George didn't stop. He didn't slow down. He kept his head slightly lowered, the brim of his hat shielding his eyes until he was 5 feet away. Then he looked up. The recognition hit the guard like a physical blow. The man's eyes widened, his professional mask slipping for a fraction of a second. Everyone in Texas knew that face. Everyone knew the eyes that had looked out from album covers for 40 years. But the guard had a job to do, and Julian Thorne paid better than the radio stations. "Mr. Strait," the guard stammered, his posture shifting from aggressive to uncertain. I can't let you in there." Mr. Thorne gave strict orders, no interruptions. George stopped 2 feet from the man. He was not the tallest man in the world, but in that moment he seemed to fill the hallway, towering with the weight of moral authority. He looked at the guard, a boy, really, maybe 25, with fear behind his tough facade. "Son," George said, his voice a low rumble, calm but vibrating with an intensity that made the air feel thin. "I am going to walk through those doors. You can either step aside and go home to your family tonight, or you can try to stop me. But I want you to look at me closely. Do I look like a man who is here to negotiate?" The guard swallowed hard. He looked at the water dripping from George's hat, the set of his jaw, the absolute terrifying stillness of his demeanor. This wasn't the smiling cowboy from the pure country movie. This was a father and a husband whose territory had been breached. The guard realized with a clarity that chilled his bones that if he touched George Strait, he wouldn't just be fighting a man, he would be fighting a legend, and he would lose. The guard stepped aside. He didn't speak. He just moved to the wall, averting his eyes, choosing survival over his paycheck. "Smart choice," George murmured, walking past him without a backward glance. He reached the double doors. He didn't knock, he didn't announce himself. He reached into his pocket, his hand brushing against the phone that was still broadcasting his wife's torment, and gripped the handle. It was locked. Of course it was locked. George took a step back, pivoted his hip, and drove the heel of his boot into the lock mechanism with a force that would have shattered a fence post. Crack. The wood splintered. The door swung inward with a violent shudder, banging against the interior wall. Inside the suite, the atmosphere shattered instantly. The room was expansive, a temple of modern luxury with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the weeping city of Houston. In the center of the room, around a glass table, sat 3 lawyers with open laptops and stacks of paper. And there, in the high-backed velvet chair, was Norma. She looked small. That was the first thing that tore at George's heart. She was curled in on herself, her arms crossed protectively over her chest, her face pale and drawn. But when the door crashed open, her head snapped up. Her eyes found him instantly. And in that second, the fear in her face vanished, replaced by a relief so profound it looked like pain. "George," she whispered, the sound barely carrying across the room. Julian Thorne was standing by the window, a tumbler of scotch in his hand. He spun around, the liquid sloshing over the rim onto his expensive carpet. For a moment, he looked like a child caught stealing from the cookie jar, eyes wide, mouth open, but he recovered quickly, the mask of the arrogant tycoon sliding back into place, though the cracks were visible. "What the hell is this?" Thorne barked, setting the glass down hard. "You can't just break in here. This is a private meeting. I'll have you arrested for trespassing and destruction of property." George stepped into the room. The water from his clothes dripped onto the pristine white marble floor, leaving a trail of dark spots. He ignored Thorne completely. He ignored the lawyers who were scrambling to close their laptops, looking like cockroaches when the kitchen light is turned on. George walked straight to Norma. He moved with a singular focus, as if the rest of the room didn't exist. He reached her chair and knelt down on one knee, bringing himself to her level. He took her cold, trembling hands in his warm, rough ones. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice soft, intimate, a stark contrast to the violence of his entry. "Did they touch you?" Norma shook her head, tears finally spilling over hot and fast. No, they wouldn't let me leave, George. They kept saying you weren't coming." George brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles, his eyes never leaving hers. "I'm always coming, Norma. There isn't a road long enough or a storm bad enough to keep me from you. You know that." He stood up then, squeezing her shoulder reassuringly before turning slowly to face the room. The transformation was terrifying. The tenderness evaporated, replaced by a cold granite hardness. He looked at the lawyers first. "Get out," George said. It wasn't a shout. It was a statement of fact. The lead lawyer, a balding man with sweat beading on his upper lip, tried to find his voice. "Mr. Strait, we are in the middle of a legal transaction regarding the land transfer. If you disrupt this, the ramifications for your foundation." "I said get out," George interrupted, taking a step toward them. "Pack your briefcases, take your papers, and if I see any of you on my ranch or near my family or even driving past my fence line, I will make it my personal mission to ensure you never practice law in this state again. Now move." The authority in his voice was absolute. These were men who fought with paper and clauses. They had no defense against a man who fought with his presence. They looked at Thorne, waiting for a command, but Thorne was silent, staring at George with a mixture of hatred and fascination. The lawyers scrambled, grabbing their things, knocking over a chair in their haste, and fled the room, leaving the door hanging open on its broken hinges. Now it was just the three of them, George, Norma, and Julian Thorne. Thorne straightened his suit jacket, trying to regain his height, trying to reclaim the power dynamic. He walked around the desk, leaning against it, crossing his ankles in a feigned display of relaxation. "So," Thorne said, a smirk playing on his lips, though his eyes remained cold. "The cowboy rides in to save the damsel. Very dramatic, George. Very cinematic. Did you rehearse that entrance?" George stared at him. "Give me her phone, Julian." Thorne chuckled, reaching into his pocket and pulling out Norma's cell phone. He tossed it onto the glass table, where it slid across and stopped near the edge. "She didn't need it. We were having such a productive conversation. You know, George, you're making a mistake, a big one. That land is worth $20 million. I'm offering you a way out, a way to be the hero who donated to the city. Instead, you want to play the tough guy." "It's not about the money," George said, his voice steady. "It never was. You know that. You tried to buy me out 3 times. You tried to bribe the zoning commission. Now you try to kidnap my wife?" "Kidnap is such a strong word." Thorne waved a hand dismissively. "She was free to go as soon as she signed, and she was going to sign, George, because she knows what I have." Thorne picked up a remote control and pointed it at the large flat-screen TV on the wall. The screen flickered to life, showing a series of documents, financial records, emails. "I have a team of forensic accountants who have been building a narrative," Thorne said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Is it true? Maybe, maybe not, but it looks bad. Money moving from the foundation to personal accounts. It's actually just reimbursement for travel, I know that. But to the public, to the fans who buy your tickets, it looks like embezzlement. It looks like the king is stealing from the poor." Norma gasped. "That's a lie. You know those records are clean." "Perception is reality, my dear," Thorne snapped. He looked back at George. "If you walk out of here with her without signing that deed, I release this packet to the press. Tomorrow morning, every news station in America will be running the story. George Strait fraud. Your legacy, George. 40 years of being the good guy gone in a news cycle. Is the land worth that? Is dirt worth your name?" George looked at the screen, at the fabricated scandal designed to destroy him. Then he looked at Thorne. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked disappointed. He looked like a man watching a child try to lift a heavy stone, only to drop it on his own foot. George reached into his pocket and pulled out his own phone. The screen was still glowing. The live feed was still active. Thorne had forgotten about the link he sent. He had forgotten that in his arrogance, he had invited George into his digital world. "You like technology, don't you, Julian?" George asked, tapping the screen. "You like streams. You like going viral." Thorne frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" George turned his phone around so Thorne could see the screen. It showed the room they were standing in. It showed Thorne, sweating, arrogant, admitting to the blackmail. "You sent me a link," George said calmly. "You wanted me to watch, so I watched. But you forgot one thing about the internet, son. It goes both ways." George walked over to the table and picked up the phone that Thorne had been using to broadcast the stream, the one propped up against a vase of flowers. He looked at the camera lens. "I didn't just watch," George continued. "When I was in the truck, I forwarded this link. I sent it to my social media team, I sent it to my publicist, and I told them to share it. Live from the negotiation, I called it." Thorne's face went white, a sickly, ghostly white. You're bluffing." "Am I?" George asked. "Check the view count, Julian." Thorne scrambled for his tablet on the desk. His fingers fumbled across the screen. When he unlocked it and found the stream, his knees visibly buckled. 2.4 million, George read the number from his own screen. "And climbing, they heard you threaten my wife. They heard you admit the documents were a narrative. They heard you call my fans the masses. You didn't just threaten me, Julian. You threatened the intelligence of every person who has ever bought a country record." The silence in the room was deafening. The rain battered against the glass, sounding like applause from the heavens. Thorne stared at the tablet, watching the comments roll in at a speed too fast to read. Stand with George was already trending. "You're done," George said, his voice devoid of pity. "The land stays with the Straits, the foundation stays clean. And you? You're going to be famous, Julian, just not the way you wanted." Thorne looked up, his eyes wild with panic. "Turn it off, George, please, turn it off. We can make a deal. I'll pay you. I'll donate to the charity. Just kill the feed." George looked at the phone in his hand. He looked at Norma, who was standing now, her strength returning as she watched her husband dismantle the monster without throwing a single punch. "I don't make deals with blackmailers," George said, "and I don't negotiate with men who scare women." He didn't turn off the stream. Instead, he propped the phone back up on the table, aiming it squarely at Thorne, who was now hyperventilating, loosening his tie, looking for an escape route that didn't exist. "Let the world see," George said. "Let them see what a man looks like when his greed eats him alive." George turned his back on Thorne. He walked over to Norma and offered her his arm, the old-fashioned gentleman once more. "Ready to go home, darling?" he asked. Norma took his arm, gripping it tightly. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with love and a profound respect. "Yes, George, take me home." They began to walk toward the door, leaving Julian Thorne alone in his glass cage, trapped in the digital prison he had built for himself. But the story wasn't over. The climax of the confrontation was finished, but the aftermath, the exit, and the final lesson were yet to come. As they reached the doorway, George stopped. He turned one last time to look at Thorne. "Oh, and Julian," George said, tipping his hat slightly, "next time you want to fight a cowboy, make sure you bring more than just a laptop." He guided Norma out into the hallway, past the broken lock, past the empty guard post. They walked to the elevator, the adrenaline beginning to fade, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. But as the elevator doors closed, shutting out the sight of the executive suite, George didn't slump. He stood tall. He held his wife's hand. The descent began, down to the lobby, down to the world that was waiting for them. The paparazzi would be there now. The police would be arriving. The storm outside was still raging, but inside the elevator, for the first time all night, there was peace. George looked at the floor indicator numbers counting down. He let out a long breath. "I'm sorry I was late," he said softly. Norma rested her head on his wet shoulder, not caring about the dampness. "You weren't late, George. You were right on time." The elevator dinged at the lobby level. The doors began to open, and the flash of cameras exploded like lightning. The world wanted to see the king, but the king just wanted to get his queen to the truck. The elevator doors parted, and the world exploded in a barrage of white light. The lobby of the Marquis Hotel had transformed from a quiet waiting area into a frenzy of media, onlookers and fans who had tracked the location from the viral stream. The flashbulbs popped in a stroboscopic rhythm that was disorienting, blinding and aggressive. A wall of sound hit them, shouts of reporters, the clicking of shutters, the murmur of a crowd that had smelled blood in the water. For a lesser man, it would have been overwhelming. For George Strait, it was just another Tuesday night, only this time the stakes were personal. He tightened his grip on Norma's hand, pulling her slightly behind him, shielding her with his body. He didn't stop moving. He didn't acknowledge the questions being hurled at him like stones. "Mr. Strait, is it true about the blackmail? Norma, are you hurt? What are you going to do about Julian Thorne?" The questions hung in the air, unanswered. George's face was a mask of stone, his hat pulled low, his eyes fixed on the exit doors 50 feet away. Big Ed was there, true to his word. The large security chief had assembled a phalanx of hotel staff and a few off-duty police officers who had arrived at the scene. They formed a human wedge cutting through the mob. Ed looked at George, a silent nod passing between them. There was no need for words. Ed saw the set of George's jaw and knew that the only priority was getting Mrs. Strait to the truck. "Make a hole," Ed bellowed, his voice booming over the chaos. "Step back, let them through." They moved through the gauntlet. Hands reached out to touch George. Phones were thrust in his face, recording every micro-expression. It was the ugly side of fame, the side that consumed rather than celebrated. But George didn't flinch. He moved with the steady, unstoppable momentum of a freight train. He kept Norma tucked against his side, his arm like an iron bar around her waist. He was the eye of the storm, the calm center in a swirling hurricane of noise. As they burst through the revolving doors and out into the humid Houston night, the air felt cleaner, despite the lingering exhaust fumes. The rain had stopped, leaving the pavement slick and reflecting the city lights like a dark mirror. The black truck was waiting where George had left it, idling, a beast ready to return to its natural habitat. George opened the passenger door for Norma. He helped her up, his hand lingering on her back for a second longer than necessary, a silent reassurance that she was safe, that the glass cage was behind her. He closed the door with a solid thud that shut out the screaming world. He walked around to the driver's side, ignoring the photographers who were now sprinting around the building to get one last shot. He climbed in, locked the doors, and shifted the truck into gear. The tires spun briefly on the wet asphalt before gripping, and the truck surged forward, leaving the hotel, the gala, and Julian Thorne in the rearview mirror. The drive out of the city was silent for a long time. The rhythmic thump-thump of the tires on the highway seams was the only sound in the cab. George drove with one hand on the wheel, his eyes scanning the road, checking the mirrors, ensuring they weren't being followed. Slowly, the concrete skyline of Houston began to recede, replaced by the sprawling suburbs, and then, finally, the dark, open embrace of the Texas countryside. The streetlights became fewer and farther between. The tension that had been holding the truck together seemed to dissipate with every mile that put distance between them and the city. Norma shifted in her seat. She looked at George, studying his profile in the dim light of the dashboard. She saw the lines of fatigue, the way his jaw was still clenched. "You really streamed it?" she asked softly, breaking the silence. George glanced at her, a small, tired smile finally touching his lips. "I didn't have a choice, Norma. Men like Thorne, they don't fear the law. They have lawyers for the law. They fear the light. They fear being seen for what they really are. I just turned on the lights. He's going to come after us," she said, a trace of worry returning to her voice. "He has resources." George reached across the center console and took her hand, interlacing their fingers. "He had resources. Tomorrow morning he's going to have liabilities. You can't unring a bell, and you can't delete what 2 million people just saw. He threatened a woman. He tried to steal land that doesn't belong to him. In Texas, that's not just a crime, Norma. That's a sin. He's done." They drove on, the headlights cutting a tunnel through the darkness. The landscape changed, becoming familiar. The fences, the mesquite trees, the shape of the hills against the starry sky. This was their country. This was the land Thorne had wanted to pave over, to turn into strip malls and condos. The thought made George's grip on the steering wheel tighten again. It wasn't just dirt. It was the history of his family. It was the place where he could be George, not the king. "I'm sorry," Norma whispered. "I shouldn't have gone to that room. I thought I could handle him. I thought I could make him understand why the land matters." George squeezed her hand. "You have nothing to apologize for. You stood your ground. You looked the devil in the eye and you didn't blink. I've never been prouder of you." He pulled the truck off the highway and onto the gravel road that led to the main gate of their ranch. The sound of gravel crunching under the tires was the sweetest music George had heard all night. It was the sound of home. The gate swung open, and they drove up the winding path past the pastures where the cattle were sleeping, past the old barn that had stood for 50 years. When they pulled up to the main house, the porch lights were on, casting a warm golden glow on the wraparound veranda. The dogs were there, barking happily, tails wagging, sensing the return of the pack leaders. George killed the engine. The silence of the ranch rushed in to fill the void. No sirens, no shouting, just the wind in the oak trees and the distant call of a coyote. They stepped out of the truck. George didn't go inside immediately. He walked around to the bed of the truck and pulled out 2 folding chairs, setting them up on the porch, right where they always sat. He went inside for a moment and returned with 2 glasses and a bottle of his own brand of tequila. He poured a small amount for each of them. Norma sat down, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. She took the glass, her hands finally steady. George sat beside her, tipping his hat back on his head, letting the cool night air dry the sweat on his brow. "To the land," George said, raising his glass. "To the truth," Norma replied, clinking her glass against his. They sat there for a long time, watching the moon rise over the property. The adrenaline was gone, replaced by a deep, contemplative peace. George thought about the world he had just left, the world of instant gratification, of digital threats, of men who thought power was something you could buy. He looked at his boots, dusty and scuffed. He looked at his wife, safe and by his side. "So you know," George said thoughtfully, looking out at the dark pasture. "Thorne called me a relic. He said I was an old brand. He thought that because I don't live on my phone, I don't understand how the world works." Norma smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "He forgot that the world was built by men like you, George, not by men like him." "Maybe," George mused, "but tonight was a reminder. The fences we build, the gates we lock, they aren't enough anymore. The wolves don't come howling at the door. They come through the fiber optics. They come through the screens." "But you stopped him," Norma said. "We stopped him," George corrected. "But it makes you think about what we're leaving behind, about what we're protecting. It's not just the acres, Norma. It's the way of life. It's the idea that a handshake means something, that you don't bully people just because you can." The next morning, the sun rose over the ranch in a blaze of glory, unaware of the digital storm that was consuming the internet. George was up before dawn, feeding the horses, doing the chores that kept him grounded. By the time he returned to the house for coffee, the news was everywhere. Julian Thorne was in police custody. The video had been shared 10 million times. The district attorney, sensing the public outrage and perhaps being a fan of country music himself, had moved swiftly. Charges of extortion, attempted kidnapping, and fraud were being filed. Thorne's investors were pulling out. His partners were distancing themselves. The Strait effect was in full swing. The country music community, the fans, the people who believed in the code of the West, had united to dismantle the man who dared to threaten the king's wife. George watched the news report on the small TV in the kitchen for about 30 seconds. He saw Thorne trying to hide his face from the cameras as he was led into the precinct. He saw the reporters talking about the heroic rescue. George turned the TV off. He didn't need the praise, he didn't need the validation, the justice was done. He walked out onto the porch again. The morning sun was bathing the fields in a soft golden light. The dew was sparkling on the grass. Norma came out, holding 2 mugs of coffee. She looked rested, the terror of the previous night washed away by the safety of the ranch. "They're calling you a hero," she said, handing him a mug. George took a sip, the dark roast warming his chest. "I'm not a hero, Norma. I'm a husband. There's a difference. A hero does it for the glory. A husband does it because he has to." He looked out at the horizon, where the blue sky met the Texas earth. He thought about the link he had clicked. He thought about the choice he had made. In a world that was becoming increasingly artificial, where reality was edited and filtered, the raw truth was the only weapon left. "You know what the funny thing is?" George asked, a twinkle returning to his eye. "What?" "I think I finally figured out how to use that live feature on the phone. Might do it again sometime." Norma laughed, a genuine hearty sound that echoed across the porch. "Don't you dare, George Strait. You leave the internet to the kids. You just keep singing." "I think I will," George said. He reached over and took her hand, his calloused thumb rubbing over her smooth skin. But first I think I'm going to take the day off. No guitars, no crowds, just us and this porch. The camera pulls back slowly. We see the two figures sitting in the rocking chairs, small against the vastness of the Texas landscape. The world keeps spinning, the internet keeps buzzing, and the cities keep growing. But on this porch, time stands still. The values that George Strait sings about, honor, loyalty, love, aren't just lyrics. They are the foundation of the house, stronger than concrete, more enduring than any viral trend. The screen fades to black, not with a bang, but with the gentle rhythmic sound of a rocking chair creaking on wooden planks and the distant, timeless song of a meadowlark greeting the day.